Welcome back to Jump Ball, your new daily dose of NBA news and opinions. I'm your host, Sam Conrad. Let's get into today's episode. So, I'm officially calling it. Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks are in a very bad situation, to say the least. They're both kind of screwed right now and in the future for, a good amount of reasons. But first off, I want to cover the fact that he has absolutely no help. Luka Doncic is who I'm talking about here. I made the case just a couple of months ago that he had a worse supporting cast than Steph Curry did. And when everybody was talking about how bad the Warriors supporting cast was for him when he was averaging like 40 to 50 points every other night, right? And I still believe that he did have a worse supporting cast back then during that time. But let's actually dive into some statistics to prove just how bad or just how poor the supporting cast is for Luka Doncic and just how exceptional he really is kind of making this team. So Luka Doncic has the highest assist rate in the entire league last year at 42.6%. The gap between him at number one and let's say Zach LaVine here at number five is 20%. 20% drop off between number one and number five spots. And there's about 500 players or more in the entire league that are getting minutes. That is ridiculous right there. That is insanity. It is completely bonkers just how much offense he overall controls for the Dallas Mavericks. If you want to look at the Mavericks offense, you are looking at it right here. Luka Doncic is the engine, is the epitome of the Dallas Mavericks offense. And to further continue into this argument, Luka Doncic averaged 27.7 points a game last year. After that, it was Kristaps Porzingis, Tim Hardaway Jr., Jalen Brunson, Josh Richardson, and we'll even throw in Dorian Finney-Smith Jr. Basically, all those guys averaged double-digit points last year. Those were the highest scoring players overall on this team. And if we look into this, Kristaps Porzingis, 79% of his shots he was assisted on, meaning 4 out of 5 shots that he took every single night, he was assisted on, and he really didn't create much of an opportunity for himself. Tim Hardaway Jr. assisted on 69% of his shots, meaning basically every 7 out of 10 shots he took, he did not have the ball in his hands and create for himself in that sort of way. In fact, he had to, basically have the shot created for him. Then we look at some of these other guys, and it's a little bit different. Jalen Brunson, assist percentage is only at 21.5%, which is pretty low. Josh Richardson, 12.3%. Both of those guys are definitely pretty low. And overall, I'm like, that's very good. That means he actually has some guys that can create for themselves when they have the ball in their hands. And even Dorian Finney-Smith here, sorry about that, even Dorian Finney-Smith here only was assisted on 7.0% of his shots. Pretty good. But there's a huge, huge, huge reason why the numbers for especially Jalen Brunson and Josh Richardson are so low, because they are not on the floor with Luka Doncic anywhere near as much as Kristaps Porzingis or Tim Hardaway Jr. is. Let's go over this. Tim Hardaway Jr., when Luka is on the floor, he was on the floor with Luka 2,465 possessions. And he was off the floor. And when Luka was off the floor, he had 1,465 possessions. Kristaps Porzingis, 1,752 possessions with Luka Doncic on the floor. With Luka off of the floor, 924. But then you move into Jalen Brunson and you move into Josh Richardson, and you have Josh Richardson with 1,263 possessions with Luka on the floor and 2,316 possessions with him off of the floor. Jalen Brunson, 1,469 possessions with Luka on the floor, 1,826 possessions with him off of the floor. Meaning these two guys, the third and fourth best scorers after Luka Doncic, were off of the floor with him so much more. And that is the reason why their assist percentage is much lower, because they had to create more shots for themselves because Luka Doncic was not on the floor to assist them. Now, Dorian Finney-Smith Jr. is actually an outlier for this, I will admit. He had 2,785 possessions with Luka Doncic on the floor, and he only had 1,069 possessions with Luka Doncic off the floor. So he is a bit of an outlier for that. But if we break this down a little bit further, these guys were also the highest frequently passed to on this team from Luka Doncic specifically here. Tim Hardaway Jr., Josh Richardson, Dorian Finney-Smith, Kristaps Porzingis, and Jalen Brunson. He basically dished out 1.4 assists to Tim Hardaway, 1.1 to Dorian Finney-Smith Jr., 1.4 to Kristaps Porzingis, and then the rest of them were split up in the pick and roll with Willie Cauley-Stein, Dwight Powell, Maxi Kleber, and then, of course, also Jalen Brunson and Josh Richardson, even though they weren't on the floor with him as much. It's insane how much offense Luka Doncic has to create for this team, and it is ridiculous. And yet, Mark Cuban thinks that this team improved considerably over the offseason. And he didn't get any help whatsoever because they managed to get Reggie Bullock and Sterling Brown. If you take a look here at the Dallas Mavericks depth chart, there has been zero significant moves made to this team. Zero significant moves whatsoever were made to this team to make them better over the offseason. They brought back Luka Doncic, but they didn't give him a legitimate second option that could create for themselves without the ball in their hands, which in my opinion is something that any, honestly, championship team needs next to their franchise cornerstone, their superstar. And the Mavericks just don't have that right now. The statistics clearly back that up. While, yes, I think Kristaps Porzingis and Tim Hardaway Jr., I think that off-ball movement is extremely important and is extremely valuable to a team. That does not make a second co-star whatsoever, in my opinion, at least. This team did not get that much better. Luka Doncic is going to be in severe trouble, at least for next season. But honestly, not even just for next season, but for the next 7 years, because he was under contract for the next 2 years because of his rookie deal. And he just signed the 5-year, $207 million supermax rookie extension with the Dallas Mavericks, meaning that he is probably with this team for another at least 3 years, maybe 4, in my opinion, because of course a player can always force themselves out of a situation. But honestly, we don't see it very often. Actually, we really haven't seen it with any player under the age of like 25. It's very uncommon to see that. And when that does happen, it's not when they're on a huge supermax extension like this. I mean, even in Giannis's case, he was making only like $25 million a year, and people were thinking that he could potentially leave in the offseason, right? But Luka Doncic is locked down here for another 7 years until he's about 30 years old, which is insane. And going forward, it just does not look good for the Dallas Mavericks in general. The Dallas Mavericks are a bad franchise in general. And the front office overall is not going to do a good job putting the right pieces around Luka, as we've already seen, but can be further backed up by with some of the stuff that I'm going to present to you now. Let's start off with draft picks. They have not made any significant draft picks recently. Even if you want to look here and look at pick 5, with Trae Young last year, who they then, of course, traded for Luka Doncic, you could say, well, that was a smart move. It was basically the pick that you had to make, right? Everybody was looking at the situation and really saying, okay, Jaren Jackson Jr. is off the board, Luka Doncic is off the board, DeAndre Ayton's off the board, Marvin Bagley's off the board. Trae Young is probably the next best available in this piece, and this team really kind of just needs a star to go forward with. Trae Young was an obvious pick. After that, let's say let's say 2012, which is the last time this team like really had a good pick in the first round. It's all nobodies. Darius Johnson Odom, I've never heard of him. Tyler Zeller, role player. Mike Muscala, pretty much a role player. Kelly Olynyk, a role player. Statnam Singh, I don't even know how to say his name. Singh Baharmra. I'm trying to say his name. I'm sorry about that. I completely butchered it. Never heard of him in my entire life. Justin Anderson, role player / out of the league. AJ Hammonds, borderline role player / out of the league. Then we get into some later years. Dennis Smith Jr. has been a role player, and that was pick 9. Shake Milton was a steal. He was really good in my opinion. They traded him to Philadelphia. Jalen Brunson was the only solid pick that they've really had in recent memory. Davidas Servidis, I'm hoping I'm saying his name right, was then traded to Detroit. He's actually a relatively solid role player, but once again, nothing significant. And then they drafted Josh Green and Tyrell Terry, who really haven't been playing much for this team whatsoever. This team has not made pretty much any good decision in the draft besides trading for Luka Doncic in the past basically 9 years. It's insane. Then if we further look into it, right? Hang on, just give me a second here. If we further look into it, even in 2011, this team, which won the championship, was widely considered to be one of the best, like not carry jobs, but one of the wildest outlier championships we've ever seen. This team was not expected to win an NBA championship whatsoever. People say, oh, maybe Dirk carried them. They were the oldest team pretty much in the entire league. They were one of the oldest teams that we've ever seen really accomplish winning a championship. They beat the super team Miami Heat. And even then, LeBron James had to have a really bad series in order for them to win. It was an outlier. It's not like this team was crazy, crazy good or anything like that. They were a very streaky team, a very old team, and it required, in my opinion, a pretty big loss in LeBron James' underperformance in order for them to win a championship. So even then, they were not considered a good team. The Dallas Mavericks have never proved that they can actually build a really good quality championship winner or championship contender, at least in my opinion. And in order to improve, they have to work through the draft, or they have to work through trades, because while yes, they are actually a relatively highly valued franchise at $2.4 billion, which puts them at 9th overall. As far as marketplace goes and like their state goes, they still have to compete with the Houston Rockets and the San Antonio Spurs. The Spurs are one of the most decorated teams of especially the recent era, but honestly, of all time. They have one of the greatest coaches, if not the greatest in some people's opinion, and Greg Popovich. It's absolutely insane what they've managed to accomplish. And the Houston Rockets are still a pretty big market as well, right? So it's not like they're competing against two nothing teams. They're competing against two pretty solid markets here. And then they still have, of course, the Brooklyn Nets, the Los Angeles Clippers, Boston Celtics, Chicago Bulls, Lakers, Warriors, and the Knicks, right? These are like some of the best teams in the entire league as far as marketplace goes. And even I'll say Philadelphia is a huge marketplace as well. Miami is a huge marketplace as well, as far as getting eyes on you as an NBA player. They are not going to land any significant players in free agency unless, of course, Luka Doncic actually manages to recruit somebody there. But even then, I'm kind of concerned that may never be able to happen because, as I just exited out of the tab, a lot of people think that Luka Doncic is going to be a very hard person to work with, or is a very hard person to work with, because his what's the way to describe it? His way of leadership is not very good. His vision of leadership is not very good. It's very demanding. It's very militant. And it doesn't always feel good for other players. It's not going to build team chemistry very well. And it's going to be hard for him to build relationships with his teammates and potentially build a championship contender around him if he doesn't get along with teammates well. And obviously, we've already seen this kind of bubble up and over with Kristaps Porzingis being a bit frustrated with his role in Dallas. Now, whether he's actually that good, whether he should be in that role or not, is up to you as an NBA fan. I kind of believe that he's, deserves to be in a secondary role. He's not a second option really whatsoever. He shouldn't have the ball in his hands all that much because that's just not the player he is, especially considering that he's super injury prone. But regardless, it's really, 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 really a really big red flag overall for this team's ability to build a team if their star player may not actually be able to recruit players to play with them, even if they are one of the best young talents in the entire NBA. And as far as their coaching future goes, I'm extremely worried about it because hopefully you've heard some of the horror stories that many people have talked about in this about Jason Kidd's coaching style, where he was just once again also extremely militant, extremely demanding, overworking his entire team, making them work on Christmas and stuff like that, making them constantly physically overworking them, taking up way too much of their time. And while yes, maybe you think that it requires a lot of time and work in order to succeed, you have to understand that not everybody's going to do that. And sometimes there are exceptions. And sometimes if you try to overwork your players, that work is actually going to negatively affect you as a coach, and also negatively affect your team because they may not actually be able to perform at the highest level because they're so exhausted. And I'm also concerned that the two military leadership styles of Jason Kidd and Luka Doncic is going to be clashing heavily in Dallas. I'm very afraid of that. There's going to be arguments between the two of them potentially on the bench. Luka Doncic could completely shut him out and just do his own thing on the floor, which may not be good overall for the team if he's not making the right decisions, which honestly, I'm not too worried about, but still, it's possible it could happen. There's just it's a mess in Dallas. There's a lot of things going wrong going wrong now and in the future, and I'm just extremely, extremely concerned about it for Luka Doncic and for the franchise as a whole. So that's all I had for you guys today. I know it was kind of a ramble, but there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Jump Ball, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you.